Hey everyone, welcome to the third and final episode of our podcast. As always, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Faith.
And this history podcast is going to be full of quickfire information while still entertaining.
Today's episode is about Egypt from the end of the French invasion to the beginning of the 20th century, or 1789 to 1900. We will give you all a timeline and an outline of our favorite acronym, SPRITE, which, as you all know, stands for social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, and economic.
Overall, you'll get a quick, summed-up version of Egypt with the two best podcast hosts, us. And we're so excited to share a little bit about this place with you.
Similar to last time, we will look at the SPRITE acronym and how it relates to Egypt at this time.
By 1820, Egypt had abolished the tax farming system. Because their agriculture was thriving, the farmers had to work even harder. The increased work also incentivized them to have larger families, as they needed their children's labor in the field. I guess there was no such thing as child labor or abuse back then. Remember how the population had significantly decreased last episode because of the famines? Well, the population of Egypt began to rise again, and by 1800 there were 7.5 million Egyptians again. Another important thing that happened during this time was conscription being made legal. This changed a lot in the country. Villagers often held funerals for their conscripted sons because most of them never even made it home. They were trained, disciplined, housed, clothed, fed, and kept healthy when they were conscripted. By 1832, the army had grown to 130,000 people. During this time, many Europeans began to come over. They were encouraged to settle in Alexandria and Cairo. They served as entrepreneurs, engineers, educators, but some were swindlers and petty criminals. However, the Europeans coming over didn't have to pay taxes, which meant the prices of housing and farmland increased. This sounds pretty similar to some situations we're facing now.
The First Egyptian-Ottoman War, the First Turco-Egyptian War, or the First Syrian War of 1831 to 1833 was brought about by Muhammad Ali Pasha's demand to the Ottoman Empire for control of Arab Greater Syria. As a result, Muhammad Ali's forces temporarily gained control of Syria and advanced. As far as Adana. This war ended in 1833 and Egypt was given control of Syria and most of Arabia. Later that same year, the Ottomans signed the Treaty of Hungary-Skelessi with Russia. Both countries agreed to mutual assistance if either country entered a military conflict.
Mehmet Ali, an Ottoman governor's reign, saw the growth of a network of canals, river ports, and cart roads. They also built grain weighing and storage facilities, cotton gins, sugar refineries, and other capital improvements. Throughout all of this, Egypt became the first non-Western state to attempt an industrial revolution, creating factories to make soap, paper, cloth, warships, and armaments. But just like the Europeans, people were forced to work in these factories for low wages and hours. Before we move on, let's take a closer look at the canals they built. These things would require at least 20,000 workers a year, and the Egyptian government would conscript them, even though slavery and forced labor were outlawed by the Ottomans years ago. To get water on the job site, a smaller canal would be cut from the Nile River. Food, equipment, and supplies would have to be transported to this bleak desert environment.
The economy in Egypt was doing pretty well during this time. With the reformed state of agriculture industry in Egypt, they introduced the growing of indigo, tobacco, and cotton. Greater agricultural yields, higher state revenues, and more Egyptians all facilitated the processes by which Mehmet Ali strengthened his rule and built his army.
Now we're going to focus on the political aspects with a timeline.
In our last episode, our timeline ended in 1798 with Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Egypt. In the absence of Napoleon's army, a few French soldiers stayed in Egypt. During this, the Ottomans hoped to use their appointed governor to rule Egypt directly using their own westernization program.
If the French, British, Mamluks, and the Ottomans weren't ruling Egypt, then who was? This political void was filled by Mehmet Ali, who had come to Egypt in 1801 with an Albanian regiment. He was an adventurer who had come to Egypt to augment the Ottoman Empire and oppose the French forces. Although he came from an Albanian background, he was trained as an Ottoman officer. Despite all of this, Mehmet Ali succeeded in Egypt where Napoleon had failed.
With his coming to power in 1801, he planned to consolidate his new position and avoid being overthrown like many previous Ottoman rulers. With the intent to seem indispensable, he directed his armies to defeat the rebels and seize the holy cities in 1818 and restored the land to Ottoman control.
Beginning in 1821, his government conscripted the Egyptian peasants into the army. However, the peasants were not in favor of this act. Also in 1821, Mehmet Ali's troops defeated the Sultan, who ruled the Upper Nile and carefully established Egyptian rule.
Things took a turn for the Ottoman Empire in 1848 when Mehmet Ali's eldest son, Ibrahim, passed away. His son had successfully assisted and solely led the Egyptian army in several campaigns and acted as a governor on his behalf. Ibrahim was the intended heir, and his death meant that they needed to find a new regent.
According to the customs of Muslim dynasties, the eldest male relative was the successor, which left Abbas Hilmi I. He was 10 years older than his uncle.
In the wake of Ali's death, Abbas reduced taxes and continued the policy of divesting state lands, factories, and schools. However, he allowed it to deteriorate after 1841.
1851 brought the award to the British of a concession to build Egyptian's first rail line. This linked Alexandria and Cairo. This shortened the journey from London to Bombay to about 6 weeks, which was revolutionary at the time.
Things took a shocking turn in 1854 when Abbas was murdered by his palace guard. Reign was taken over by Said Mehmet Ali's eldest surviving son. His reign did not last as long as he began borrowing money from European bankers to finance luxuries such as railroads, telegraph lines, and ambitious work projects. When his successor, Khedive Ismail, came into power in 1863, Egypt had roughly $30 million US of debt.
Ismail, the son of Ibrahim, seemed to be a promising ruler for all. The early years of his rule were a boom period in Egypt. They were one of few countries that could produce large quantities of cotton due to the American Civil War. By 1863, prices of cotton from Egypt were heavily inflated. By the end of Ismail's rule, Egypt was in even more debt than before.
Just like the last episode, we have come prepared with a primary source to share with all of you. But first, a little background information.
Just a bit outside of our timeline, in 1904, there was a series of agreements signed by France and the United Kingdom called the Entente Cordiale. This was a treaty that served as a friendly understanding between the two political powers. It was considered less formal than an alliance, though. In this treaty, the French agreed to grant Britain freedom of action in Egypt as long as the French got freedom in Morocco.
This treaty was 14 articles long, so we are just going to read the first one. Declaration between the United Kingdom and France respecting Egypt and Morocco, together with the secret article signed at the same time. His Britannic Majesty's government declared that they have no intention of altering the political status of Egypt.
The government of the French Republic, for their part, declared that they will not obstruct the action of Great Britain in that country.
It is agreed that the post of Director General of Antiquities in Egypt shall continue, as in the past, to be entrusted to a French savant.
The French schools in Egypt shall continue to enjoy the same liberty as in the past. This was just the beginning of the Egyptians being granted their freedom instead of being under the control of another political power.
Well, that concludes our last episode. We are so glad you all came back to listen to us yap. Thanks for listening to one of the more interesting countries during these time periods.
We got to learn so much, and we hope you all did too. Bye!